Ma'am, I strongly advise you to remove your hand from that terminal. The words were spoken with a quiet, steady weight that didn't belong in a room filled with billionaires and elite engineers. Victoria Sterling, the brilliant and fiercely guarded CEO of Sterling Dynamics, froze for a fraction of a second. Her fingers hovered just inches above the biometric glass of the primary control matrix inside Chicago's Vanguard spire. Slowly, she turned her head, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the man who had dared to interrupt her. He wore the standard dark charcoal uniform of a late-shift facility technician. His boots were clean but worn at the edges, and his eyes carried the quiet, heavy exhaustion of a man who worked long hours to build a life from scratch. Beside him stood a dented metal toolbox. To the executives crowding the glass-walled corridor, he looked completely out of place, a background character in a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. A few of the vice presidents behind Victoria chuckled softly, the sound dripping with condescension. One of the senior software leads muttered something about floor staff trying to play tech support. "Do you have any idea what this terminal regulates, officer?" Victoria asked, her voice like ice cutting through the climate-controlled air of the command deck. Her tone was calculated, designed to remind everyone exactly who held the power in this room. Garrett Vance didn't flinch. He didn't lower his gaze, nor did he raise his voice to match her coldness. He simply looked at the cascading lines of amber data scrolling across the panoramic wall monitors, then down at the small, rhythmic pulse of a defensive light sequence, blinking at the edge of the console.
"I know exactly what it regulates, ma'am,"
Garrett said softly. "The Aegis 7 core is currently attempting to sync with your legacy infrastructure. The architecture isn't holding the handshake. If you force the master override right now, the defensive protocols will interpret the command as an external intrusion." Victoria folded her arms, her posture radiating absolute authority. She was a woman who had fought her way to the top of the aerospace and defense tech industry. She didn't take counsel from evening shift technicians. "This migration has been simulated 3,000 times by the finest engineering minds in the country," she said flatly. "The system is perfectly stable. Step back and return to your assigned floor." Garrett inhaled slowly. The command deck smelled faintly of ozone, expensive leather, and success. But beneath the surface, he could feel the subtle vibration in the floorboards, the nervous hum of a massive digital network preparing to defend itself. He knew this system. He knew its temperament. Long before he ever wore a technician's uniform, before tragedy had stripped away his old life and forced him to choose anonymity over ambition, he had studied logic paths exactly like this one. He knew what happened when an arrogant hand forced a machine into a corner. "I'm just telling you what the system is preparing to do," Garrett replied, his voice remaining remarkably calm, grounded, and entirely devoid of malice. It would be wise to wait for the diagnostic cycle to clear. Silas Finch, the lead systems architect for the project, stepped forward with an irritated scowl. "Mrs. Sterling, we don't have time for this. The board is waiting for the confirmation signal. The technician is clearly out of his depth. He probably thinks a flickering warning light means a hardware fire." The room filled with more relaxed, mocking laughter. Victoria turned away from Garrett, completely dismissing his presence. She reached out, her palm pressing firmly against the biometric scanner to authorize the global system override. Garrett didn't jump forward to stop her. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his grip on the handle of his toolbox, his face settling into a look of quiet, sorrowful resignation. He had given his warning. Now, the natural law of engineering would take over. The terminal chimed a sharp digital sound that echoed through the glass corridor. For 2 seconds, a brilliant blue light washed over the command deck. The executives smiled, ready to congratulate each other on a historic system deployment. Then, the blue light snapped to a violent, solid crimson. Deep within the bowels of the Vanguard spire, a massive, metallic thud shook the concrete foundations. It was followed by another, closer this time, and then another. The sound of heavy, reinforced titanium security barriers slamming shut echoed through the ventilation shafts like a series of distant explosions. The laughter evaporated instantly. The smiles vanished from the faces of the executives. Silas Finch lunged toward his tablet, his fingers suddenly trembling as the screen erupted into a chaotic waterfall of red error messages and access denied warnings. "What did you do?" Victoria demanded, spinning around to face her lead engineer, a sudden spike of panic piercing through her guarded composure. "Why are the perimeter seals dropping?" Silas didn't look up, his face losing all color. "The system. It's rejecting our credentials. It's locking down the entire upper pavilion. The overhead lights flickered once, dying out completely before the harsh, red emergency illumination kicked in, painting the room in deep, dramatic shadows. Radios on the security guards' belts began screaming with static and panicked voices from the lower levels. Garrett stood perfectly still in the center of the crimson glow, his steady presence the only anchor in a room rapidly descending into chaos. He quietly set his toolbox down, his eyes fixed on the primary security map as the system began drawing an unbreakable cage around them. No one in this room was ready for what was coming next. The primary containment cycle had just begun, and the building was no longer listening to its billionaire owner. The heavy titanium door behind Victoria sealed with a final, definitive click. The digital display above it went completely dark, cutting off the executive elevator bank entirely. Reroute the main power grid to the secondary terminals. Silas Finch yelled, his voice cracking under the sudden pressure. His hands flew across his tablet, but the screen merely flashed an unyielding crimson bar. It's not taking the commands. Every bypass I try is being treated as an active threat vector. Victoria stood rigidly, her gaze fixed on the main diagnostic wall. The red emergency lights cast long, dramatic shadows across her face, accentuating the sudden, sharp tension in her jaw. She was used to being in control of every variable, every board meeting, every multi-million-dollar acquisition. This absolute silence from her own system was a foreign, terrifying sensation. "Get it back online, Silas," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "I don't care what protocols you have to override. Do it now." "I'm trying, Mrs. Sterling." But the Aegis core has completely isolated the command deck. We are locked out of the primary server layer. Silas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his engineering brilliance crumbling into frantic, messy guesswork. From the side of the room, Garrett Vance quietly stepped closer to the auxiliary monitoring station. He didn't touch the keys. Instead, he simply watched the cascading error logs with a practiced, analyzing gaze. To anyone else, the scrolling numbers were a chaotic mess of data. To Garrett, they were a perfectly predictable sequence. "You're wasting your time with the secondary terminals," Garrett said, his voice a striking contrast to the panic vibrating through the room. It was steady, grounded, and entirely calm. "The system has already initiated a level 4 isolation cascade. It's shutting down the vertical transit veins." Silas snapped his head around, his frustration boiling over. "You're a maintenance technician. You fix broken conduits and check ventilation seals. Stop talking about network cascades like you have a degree in systems engineering." Garrett didn't argue. He didn't try to defend his intelligence or boast about his past. He merely pointed a calloused finger toward the corner of the panoramic display wall, where a tiny blue and white node map of the building was rapidly shifting to dark amber. "Watch the structural elevator shafts on floors 40 through 60, Garrett murmured quietly. "The magnetic brakes are engaging manually. The system is cutting off the upper pavilion floor by floor to prevent what it perceives as data bleeding." Before Silas could utter another word of dismissal, a deep, resonant groan echoed through the core of the skyscraper. The faint, structural hum of the high-speed elevators died completely. On the screen, the node map for floors 40 through 60 turned a solid, unforgiving red. Silas stared at his tablet, his mouth opening slightly as the exact error code Garrett had just described materialized on his screen. "How? How did you know that?" he whispered, his eyes widening as a cold wave of suspicion finally began to settle into the room. Victoria turned slowly, her sharp eyes locking onto Garrett. The dismissive irritation she had carried moments before was replaced by a calculated, intense curiosity. She walked toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards despite the chaos around them. "You spoke about a handshake failure before I touched the console," Victoria said, her gaze searching his tired face, trying to read the man behind the faded uniform. "And you knew the exact containment tier before the chief architect of this project did. Who are you?" Garrett met her stare without a trace of intimidation. "I'm the man who keeps the lights on, ma'am," he said softly. "And right now, you have a much bigger problem than figuring out my resume." Before Victoria could press him further, the primary security monitor in the center of the wall flickered, switching from the data log to an internal closed-circuit camera feed. The camera was aimed at the private executive lounge located exactly on the 55th floor, a restricted, luxurious space separated from the main offices by reinforced glass doors. Inside the frame, an 8-year-old boy with dark hair was standing directly against the heavy glass barrier. He was clutching a small breathing inhaler in his right hand, his left hand pressing desperately against the seamless glass. The heavy, automated titanium shutters had dropped completely behind him, sealing off the exits and the emergency stairwells. He was entirely alone, trapped in a soundproof vault, and his small shoulders were already beginning to heave with the frantic, rapid breaths of an oncoming asthma attack. The icy, impenetrable mask that Victoria Sterling had worn for years shattered in a single second. The ruthless, multi-billionaire CEO vanished, replaced by a terrified mother whose world was suddenly collapsing behind an unbreakable wall of glass. "Julian," she gasped, lunging toward the monitor, her hands hitting the plastic frame of the display. Her voice lost all its carefully cultivated authority, cracking with an agonizing, helpless panic. "Oh my God, Julian, turn off the seals on 55. Silas, open that door right now." Silas desperately hammered on his touchscreen, his face slick with sweat. "I can't." The quarantine protocol has completely isolated the executive lounge. The system thinks that sector is the epicenter of the breach. "It's completely unresponsive to executive clearance." Victoria spun around, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling violently. She looked at her elite engineers, her security guards, her highly paid executives, and saw nothing but frozen, helpless terror reflecting back at her. Money, power, and status had completely lost their utility. Then she looked at Garrett. He hadn't frozen, his posture hadn't changed, but the tired look in his eyes had hardened into something fiercely protective, focused, and steady. "He's panicking," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the technician, completely vulnerable for the first time in her life. "He doesn't have his full medical kit in there. He's going to lose consciousness. Please, tell me, you know how to open that door." Garrett stepped up to the main console, his movements calm and entirely deliberate. "The system gives you exactly 6 minutes before a quarantine sector goes into hard atmospheric lockdown," he said, his quiet masculinity grounding the entire room. "Step back, Mrs. Sterling. Let me talk to the machine." Silas Finch stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab Garrett's shoulder. "Get away from that console. You're going to corrupt the entire node array. This terminal is direct link to the primary defense matrix. One wrong keystroke and you could wipe the company's entire cloud backup." Garrett didn't move. He didn't even flinch as Silas's hand neared him. He simply shifted his weight, his broad shoulders moving in a way that carried an undeniable, quiet authority that made the lead engineer hesitate mid-motion. "Silas, step back," Victoria commanded. Her voice didn't have its usual icy precision. It was ragged, trembling with a raw terror that shook the entire room. "But Mrs. Sterling, he's a mechanic." Silas protested, his face flushed with embarrassment and panic. "He doesn't know the first thing about quantum encryption, or he knew the vertical shafts were going to lock down before you did," Victoria interrupted, her eyes never leaving the monitor where her son was leaning against the glass, gasping for air. "Look at my son, Silas. Your credentials are dead. Your bypasses are blocked. If he thinks he can do something, let him work." Silas opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer desperation radiating from the billionaire CEO silenced him. He stepped back, his jaw tight, his pride deeply wounded. Garrett didn't waste a single second on corporate politics. His fingers, calloused from years of manual labor but precise as a surgeon's, began moving across the secondary command interface. He didn't use the standard touch menus that Silas had been desperately hammering. Instead, he swiped past the graphical user interface entirely, opening a raw, black command terminal hidden deep beneath the system's display layers. "What are you doing?" Silas whispered, leaning in closer despite himself. "That's a root-level terminal architecture. That shouldn't even be accessible from an auxiliary deck." Garrett didn't look up. "Every system has a backdoor for maintenance," he said quietly. "You just have to know how to talk to it." He typed a rapid sequence of alphanumeric strings. To Silas, the syntax looked completely foreign. It wasn't the standard code used by Sterling Dynamics' modern software suite. It was older, more robust, designed with an elegant simplicity that prioritized absolute control over aesthetics. On the television screen, Julian was dropping to his knees, his face pale as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The asthma attack was peaking, fueled by the rising heat in the quarantined room as the automated environmental systems began shutting down vents to prevent potential contamination. Victoria gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles turning bone white. Her eyes filled with tears, a rare vulnerability breaking through her cold exterior. She had millions in her bank account, a global tech empire at her fingertips, and yet she was entirely helpless to save her own child. Garrett noticed her trembling hands out of the corner of his eye. Without stopping his typing, he reached over and pressed a physical toggle on the side of the desk. A soft static hum echoed from the overhead speakers, and a small green light illuminated on the camera feed inside the executive lounge. "Julian," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an incredible grounding warmth. It was the voice of a father who had spent countless nights soothing his own child through fevers and nightmares. It was a sound of absolute safety. On the screen, the little boy lifted his head, his tear-streaked eyes looking around the empty lounge until they found the hidden intercom speaker. "Julian, my name is Garrett," the technician continued, his tone perfectly steady, absorbing the panic in the room like a lightning rod. "I'm right here with your mom. She can see you, and we are working on opening that door right now. But I need you to do something for me, buddy. Can you look at the green light on the wall?" The boy nodded weakly, his small frame shaking as he focused on the camera lens. "Good boy," Garrett said softly, his fingers still flying across the keyboard, entering a complex series of routing commands. "I want you to match my breathing. Don't worry about the air in the room. Just listen to my voice. In through your nose, hold it, out through your mouth. Nice and slow." Victoria watched in stunned silence. She had spent a fortune on top-tier therapists and coaches to help Julian manage his anxiety-induced asthma, but in the middle of a high-tech crisis, it was a quiet man in a faded maintenance uniform who was effortlessly calming her son down. She saw the absolute contrast between her wealth and this man's innate emotional strength. Money could buy the spire, but it couldn't buy the safety this stranger was projecting with just his voice. On the screen, Julian's breathing began to regulate. He lifted his inhaler, taking a steady, controlled puff, his eyes locked onto the camera as if Garrett's voice was a physical hand holding him up. Silas, meanwhile, was staring at the black terminal screen, his eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing shock. He pointed a trembling finger at the bottom of the monitor where a specific line of code had just generated. "Wait. That encryption override protocol," Silas stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "That's a proprietary master cipher. It was only ever implemented by the original systems architect before the project was commercialized. The man who wrote the foundational security code for the United States Defense Network." Victoria tore her eyes away from her son, looking sharply at Silas, then at Garrett. "What are you talking about, Silas?" "The original designer vanished from the grid 5 years ago," Silas said, his face pale as he stared at the technician's hands. He was a myth in the engineering community, a genius who walked away from a billion-dollar legacy. No one else has these access codes. Garrett didn't look up from the keyboard. The final command string was almost complete. But as his finger hovered over the execution key to open the executive lounge, the crimson light on the terminal didn't fade to green. Instead, a massive, block-letter prompt flashed across every panoramic screen in the command deck, overriding Garrett's inputs. Critical warning: master architect privileges degraded. Secondary factor required. Provide personal encryption identifier to prevent total system hard lock in 120 seconds. The countdown began ticking down in giant bleeding red numbers. 119. 118. Silas gasped, collapsing back against a desk. "It's over. The system thinks he's a ghost. It's asking for a personal identifier that doesn't exist in our corporate database. It's going to seal the entire tower forever." Victoria looked at Garrett, her heart hammering against her ribs as the countdown dropped further. "Garrett, what is it asking for?" Garrett stared at the blinking prompt. The quiet technician slowly reached into his pocket, his hand tightening around a worn silver military dog tag hidden beneath his uniform. The crimson numbers of the countdown clock bled into the polished glass walls, dropping mercilessly. 98. 97. Silas Finch backed away from the console, his hands throwing up in the air as pure terror distorted his features. "I knew it. He broke the routing array. This man isn't trying to help us, Mrs. Sterling. He's sabotaging the tower. He's trying to trigger a total network wipe. Security, grab him. Get him away from that desk before he locks us in this building permanently." Two armed corporate security guards stepped forward, their hands moving toward their holsters, their expressions torn between the chaos around them and their training. "Stand down!" Victoria shouted. Her voice, usually a weapon of quiet intimidation, rose to a desperate scream that echoed off the high ceilings. She stepped directly between the guards and Garrett, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. "Don't you dare touch him. Look at the screens. Look at my son!" On the closed-circuit monitor, the air filtration vents inside the executive lounge closed with a heavy, pressurized hiss. A small digital indicator in the corner of the camera feed showed the oxygen flow dropping to 0. The quarantine protocol was sealing the room completely, starving the space of fresh air to contain what it still believed was a volatile cyber attack. Julian was on his knees now, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with a child's pure, unadulterated fear as he looked at the camera light. Victoria turned back to Garrett. The untouchable billionaire, the woman who ruled a tech empire with ruthless, unemotional precision, fell to her knees right beside his worn toolbox. She reached out, her hands trembling violently as she grabbed the fabric of his dark maintenance uniform. Her knuckles were white, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Please, Garrett," she whispered, her voice completely broken, stripped of all pride, wealth, and status. "I don't care who you are. I don't care about the company, or the system, or the billions of dollars on those servers. Just save my boy. Please, don't let my son suffocate behind that glass." Garrett looked down at her. In the harsh crimson glare of the emergency lights, his quiet masculinity felt like the only solid object in a world that was melting away. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he look at her with the smug satisfaction of a man who had been proven right. He looked at her as a parent. He thought of his own daughter Lily waiting for him, and the fierce protective instinct that governed his entire life surged to the surface. He placed a hand gently over her trembling fingers, his touch warm, solid, and completely grounding. "Get up, Mrs. Sterling," Garrett said softly, his voice carrying an ironclad certainty that made her breathing slow down. "I'm not going to let anything happen to him." Garrett turned back to the blinking command line. The clock showed 52 seconds. He pulled the silver military dog tag completely out from beneath his uniform collar. The metal clicked against the edge of the aluminum keyboard. He didn't want to do this. He had spent 5 long years hiding in the shadows, erasing his footsteps, trading the praise of global defense agencies for the quiet simplicity of fixing pipes and sweeping floors, just so he could be a present father to his little girl. But looking at Julian's pale face on the monitor, Garrett knew the hiding was over. His fingers struck the keys with terrifying speed. He didn't type a password. He typed a highly classified, military-grade algorithmic sequence, a personal biometric cipher key that had been hard-coded into the foundational bedrock of the United States defense network architecture over a decade ago. The terminal screen instantly shifted from black to an intense, blinding gold. Silas Finch leaned forward, his mouth hanging open, his breath catching in his throat as he read the system strings generating across the primary diagnostic wall. What? What language is that? That's not corporate encryption. That's a Tier 1 Department of Defense tactical protocol. The countdown clock stopped at exactly 12 seconds. The bleeding red numbers vanished, replaced by a single, massive, high-security data profile that began unfolding across every single panoramic monitor on the command deck. A high-resolution military identification photograph materialized on the main wall. It showed Garrett, years younger, standing in a pristine white hangar, wearing a decorated dress uniform adorned with medals of valor, flanked by advanced fighter prototypes and stealth aircraft. A synthetic, authoritative system voice suddenly boomed through the high-fidelity overhead speakers, replacing the frantic alarm chirps with absolute clarity. Warning. Master Architect overrides detected. Legacy database cross-referencing active. Welcome back, Commander Garrett Vance. Chief Aerospace Engineer, United States Naval Intelligence Division, retired. Founder of the Aegis Security Matrix. The entire hallway fell into a paralyzing, breathless silence. The executives stood like statues. Silas Finch dropped his tablet, the glass screen shattering against the floorboards, but he didn't even notice. He just stared at the maintenance worker, his mind completely collapsing under the weight of the revelation. Victoria slowly rose to her feet, her eyes moving from the massive military profile on the wall back to the quiet, single father standing before her. The man who had been changing light bulbs and fixing structural doors in her facility was the legendary missing architect of modern tactical defense. Garrett didn't look at any of them. He didn't give the crowd a single second to process their shock. He hit a final sequence on the console. "System," Garrett commanded, his voice deep, resonant, and dripping with an authority that the machine recognized instantly. "Terminate quarantine protocol on Sector 15. Release the pneumatic seals on the executive lounge immediately." The system voice responded without hesitation. Command accepted, initializing master architect release. On the closed-circuit monitor, the heavy titanium doors of the executive lounge suddenly sparked with life. A massive mechanical hiss echoed through the vertical core of the building as the seals broke apart, and the reinforced glass doors began to slide open. But as the doors parted, the camera feed suddenly flickered with violent static, and a loud electronic screech tore through the speakers. The gold screen snapped back to blood red, and a new alert flashed across the deck. Critical failure. External breach attempt detected. Anonymous source enforcing cyberlock on Section 15. Environmental matrix. Oxygen isolation resuming. Garrett's eyes narrowed as he realized this was no longer an internal software glitch. Someone outside the tower was actively fighting him for control of the child's life. The high-pitched whine of the terminal feedback cut through the command deck like a physical blow. Silas Finch fell backward against a row of server racks, his eyes darting frantically across the shifting patterns of red light. "An external breach?" Silas stammered, his voice climbing to a near hysterical pitch. "That is impossible! Our external fiber lines are physically shielded. No one should even be able to find the routing node during a system migration." "They did not find it just now," Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifyingly calm weight of a tactical commander under fire. "They have been sitting in your network for months, waiting for the one moment the firewall dropped its guard to handshake with the new core. They are using your own migration script as a cloaking device." Victoria did not care about the network. She did not care about industrial espionage. She only saw her son through the panning security camera. Julian had collapsed onto his side on the carpeted floor of the executive lounge, his chest heaving under a shallow, erratic rhythm. The green light on the intercom speaker flickered violently as the external intrusion actively tried to cut the audio link Garrett had established. "Garrett!" Victoria cried out, her voice cracking as she slammed both palms against the reinforced glass partition overlooking the lower core. The absolute control she had maintained over her multi-billion-dollar empire for a decade meant nothing now. She was a mother watching the air being slowly stolen from her child's lungs. "They are suffocating him. Do something, please." Garrett kept his eyes locked on the amber data feed. He did not let the rising panic in the room touch him. When the world became chaotic, his mind did what it had been trained to do through years of covert operations and high-stakes engineering failures. It became perfectly still. "Silas," Garrett said, not looking up from the keys. "Shut down the secondary regional uplinks. Now. I cannot." Silas cried, his fingers shaking so hard he nearly dropped his secondary console interface. "The external signal has locked out the command interface. If I force a hard shutdown on the regional uplinks, it will cause a data loop that could blow the main breakers. We will lose the entire facility's power, then let it blow." Victoria snapped, spinning around, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, desperate fury. "Cut the power. Cut everything. Just get that door open." "If the main breakers blow while the system is in quarantine mode, the pneumatic locks will default to a permanent mechanical seal," Garrett explained, his steady, masculine cadence acting as the only restraint keeping the room from dissolving into complete madness. "The emergency oxygen valves will freeze shut. We have to beat the intrusion at the logic layer. We have to make the attacker believe they have already won." Victoria stared at him, her lips trembling, her hands catching her weight against the edge of his technician's desk. She had spent her entire life believing that enough capital, enough legal power, and enough engineering superiority could insulate her from vulnerability. Yet here, in the heart of her own crown jewel skyscraper, she was entirely dependent on a man who, until 20 minutes ago, she had treated as completely invisible. "What do you need me to do?" Victoria whispered, her voice stripped of its armor, leaving only a raw, desperate trust. "I need you to stay steady, Mrs. Sterling," Garrett said softly, turning his head just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes held an ancient, battle-tested certainty. "Look at Julian. Keep talking to him. Do not let him look at the red lights." Victoria swallowed hard, nodding rapidly as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. She turned back to the intercom microphone, her hands shaking as she pressed the toggle. "Julian, Sweetie, it is Mom. Stay right there. Keep listening to Garrett's voice. We are right here. Garrett's fingers returned to the keyboard, but the rhythm of his typing changed. It was no longer the rapid searching sequence of an engineer diagnosing a problem. It was the deliberate, aggressive cadence of a military strategist laying an ambush. He did not try to block the external IP address. He did not waste time building firewalls that the attacker had already bypassed. Instead, he opened a deeply buried subroutine titled Phalanx 9. Silas Finch leaned forward, squinting through his fogged glasses at the code unfolding on the gold screen. Phalanx? That is a countermeasure algorithm from the old naval intelligence spec sheets. That was never authorized for commercial deployment. I did not ask for corporate authorization when I wrote the core framework, Silas, Garrett murmured, his tone dry, sharp, and entirely focused. On the screen, the external hacker's signal began aggressively consuming the data packets in the executive wing, thinking it was isolating the room's environmental controls completely. But Garrett was not fighting the theft. He was feeding it. He was actively opening specific data channels, guiding the attacker's intrusion directly into a localized sandbox network that looked exactly like the building's master control grid. The countdown timer on the screen suddenly stopped its descent, freezing at 44 seconds. The violent crimson glow in the hallway faltered, shifting into a tense, vibrating amber. The technician beside Silas gasped. Look at the data routing. He is not blocking them. He is tracing them back through the encrypted proxy layers. He is dragging their real-world location right into our terminal feed. Garrett did not celebrate. He kept typing, his face grim as the system began peeling back the layers of the attacker's cloaking network. The digital footprint was highly sophisticated, utilizing military-grade spoofing algorithms that only a handful of global logistics firms or defense competitors possessed. The system chimed, a sharp, clear note that cut through the heavy silence of the command deck. Proxy Layer 1 cleared. Proxy Layer 2 cleared. Origin point localized. A map of downtown Chicago materialized on the panoramic wall. A single, bright blue target grid snapping directly onto a luxury corporate suite located exactly 3 blocks away. The local headquarters of Apex Global Logistics, Victoria's fiercest competitor for the upcoming multi-billion-dollar government defense contract. Victoria's breath hitched in her throat as she stared at the glowing blue target. Apex, Jonathan Vance's firm. They did this. They tried to sabotage the migration to ruin the contract bid. And they do not care if they kill my son to do it. Garrett frozen for a split second when the name appeared on the screen. The silver dog tag resting against the aluminum keyboard seemed to catch the amber light. A shadow crossed his face, a deep, painful memory tightening the muscles of his jaw. Silas looked from the screen to Garrett, his voice dropping into a terrified whisper. Wait, Apex Global is owned by Jonathan Vance. Your last name is Vance. Garrett did not answer. He simply struck the enter key with a definitive, echoing thud, launching a massive, destructive counterdata spike back down the line directly into the Apex server core. The game is over, Garrett said quietly, his eyes burning with a cold, protective rage. Let us see how long they hold their lock when their own house starts burning down. The gold screen flared with blinding intensity as the counter-data spike surged down the fiber optic lines. On the panoramic display, the blue target grid tracking the headquarters of Apex Global Logistics suddenly turned into a cascading waterfall of collapsing data strings. The attacker's hostile lock on the executive lounge did not just loosen. It was violently torn apart by the sheer architectural weight of Garrett's Phalanx 9 protocol. Across the command deck, the crimson emergency lights flickered, gasped, and died. In their place, the crisp, pure White House lights of the Vanguard spire snapped back into existence, illuminating the pale, stunned faces of Victoria's executive board. The synthetic system voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers, its tone completely stripped of the previous panic alerts. External intrusion neutralized. Data integrity verified at 100%. Regional uplinks stabilized, restoring environmental matrices to Sector 15. On the closed-circuit monitor, a rush of fresh, cool oxygen hissed through the ventilation grates of the executive lounge. Julian, still sitting on the carpeted floor, took a long, deep, unobstructed breath. The trembling in his small frame subsided as the clean air filled his lungs, and he looked up at the camera light with a faint, exhausted smile. The heavy titanium reinforcement barriers across the entire command deck began to slide upward with a synchronized mechanical hum. The vertical elevator shafts chimed, their indicator lights shifting from a dead red back to a functional, welcoming green. The cage had opened. Victoria did not wait for the elevator doors to fully clear. The moment the primary security gate retracted, she threw off her designer heels and ran down the executive corridor toward the private elevator. She bypassed her security team, her vice presidents, and her engineers, driven entirely by the primal instinct of a mother who had just stared into the abyss and gotten her child back. When the elevator doors opened on the 55th floor, she threw her arms around Julian, pulling him into her lap on the floor of the lounge. She buried her face in his dark hair, her shoulders shaking with silent, heavy sobs. For years, she had built a reputation as an iron-willed titan of industry who felt nothing. But in this quiet room, holding her son, she was entirely human. She held him as if the millions of dollars, the corporate espionage, and the massive defense contract did not exist. Up on the command deck, the silence was absolute. Silas Finch stood frozen in front of the master console, his hands hovering over the empty air where his tablet used to be. His eyes were wide, fixed entirely on the massive military profile, still dominating the center wall monitor. The image of a decorated naval intelligence commander, flanked by experimental stealth fighter jets, cast a long shadow over the chief architect's pride. He slowly turned his head to look at Garrett. The man was still standing calmly beside the technician's workstation, his hands resting lightly on his worn metal toolbox. His dark charcoal uniform was slightly rumpled, and his eyes carried that same quiet, patient exhaustion. He looked like an ordinary blue-collar worker, yet he had just dismantled a state-of-the-art international cyber warfare attack using a system he had coded in his youth. "Commander." "Vance," Silas stammered, his voice dropping into a hollow, trembling whisper. The condescension and arrogance that had defined his tone all evening were completely gone, replaced by a paralyzing, profound awe. You are the Vance from the original Pentagon Aerospace Initiative, the one who designed the automated global defense net." The junior engineers behind Silas exchanged rapid, stunned glances. One of them actually dropped his pen, staring at Garrett as if a ghost had just materialized in the room. "I use the name Garrett here, Silas," the single father said softly. His voice remained perfectly grounded, entirely devoid of the need to boast or humiliate the man who had mocked him minutes before. The uniform says Facility Technician. That is the only title that matters on this shift. But you just executed a Tier 1 tactical counterstrike from a maintenance auxiliary terminal, Silas whispered, his face flushing with an intense, burning humiliation. "We treated you like. We thought you were just." Garrett picked up his dented travel mug from the desk, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his lukewarm coffee. "You thought I was invisible," Garrett replied quietly, his words carrying an undeniable masculine weight that echoed through the silent corridor. "Systems do not fail because of the code, Silas. They fail because the people running them become too arrogant to see the small warnings right in front of their faces. You were looking at my uniform. You should have been looking at the amber handshake loop." The executive board members shifted uncomfortably, several of them looking down at the polished floorboards, unable to meet the technician's steady gaze. The power dynamic in the room had completely flipped. The man they had dismissed as a low-level employee was the single reason their multi-billion-dollar company still existed. The elevator doors chimed again, and Victoria stepped back onto the command deck, holding Julian tightly against her hip. The little boy's chin rested on her shoulder, his breathing now perfectly rhythmic and steady. Victoria stopped in the center of the room. She looked at her chief architect, her security leads, and her wealthy advisors, her eyes cold and demanding. Then, her gaze shifted to Garrett. The icy barrier that usually protected her emotions melted away, replaced by a deep, reverent respect that no one in the history of Sterling Dynamics had ever seen her give to another human being. She walked directly toward him, her bare feet silent against the floor. She did not speak as a billionaire CEO addressing a technician. She spoke as a mother who owed a man her life. "Thank you, Garrett," she said, her voice soft but completely clear. Garrett gave a polite, gentle nod, his expression softening as he looked at Julian. "Just glad he is safe, ma'am." Victoria tightened her hold on her son, but her sharp mind was already pivoting back to the data on the wall. She looked at the target grid pointing at Apex Global Logistics. The counterstrike had neutralized the breach, but the digital trail was out in the open. "Silas, download the intrusion logs and prepare a formal briefing for the Federal Defense Intelligence Council," Victoria commanded, a fraction of her ruthless precision returning to her voice. We are going to destroy Apex by sunrise. Silas didn't move. He kept staring at the gold screen, his hands shaking as a new, unexpected diagnostic line began to generate beneath the Phalanx 9 log. Mrs. Sterling. Look at the secondary routing stream, Silas whispered, his voice cracking with a fresh wave of terror. The intrusion. It didn't originate from an outside hacker working for Apex. Victoria frowned, stepping closer. What do you mean? The target grid snapped directly onto their corporate suite. Yes, Silas stammered, pointing a trembling finger at a deeply buried authentication key that was now displaying on the screen. But the encryption token used to grant the external attacker access to our migration script, it didn't come from Apex. It was issued from an authorized terminal inside this very room. The command deck went completely rigid. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she realized the horrifying truth. The person who had tried to suffocate her son was standing right next to her. The silence that blanketed the command deck was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The White House lights illuminated every line of sweat, every widened eye, and every pale face among the elite gathering of executives. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her fingers digging into the fabric of Julian's small jacket. The revelation that the threat had been authorized from within her own inner circle seemed to hit her harder than the cyber attack itself. She had built this company on a foundation of absolute loyalty, screening every executive through rigorous security protocols. Yet, the proof was flashing on the massive gold monitor in front of her. Isolate the internal MAC address, Garrett said. His voice was a calm, steady blade cutting through the paralyzing shock of the room. He didn't look at Victoria, nor did he look at the trembling board members. His eyes remained fixed on the logic pathways of the Aegis core. Silas Finch, his hands still shaking violently, tapped a command into his secondary interface. I'm trying. It's masked behind an administrative proxy. Whoever did this had high-level encryption clearance. They used an old maintenance bypass sequence, Garrett murmured, his fingers dancing across the keys with an effortless, fluid precision. It's a signature style. They didn't want to just steal the data. They wanted to ensure the quarantine stayed locked until the oxygen levels depleted. They wanted a casualty to permanently invalidate Sterling Dynamics' government safety certification. Victoria's gaze sharpened, a terrifying, icy fury replacing the vulnerability in her eyes. Find them, Garrett. Garrett struck a single key. The gold screen rippled, and a localized hardware mapping sequence unfolded. A bright blue radar sweep radiated outward from the primary console, scanning every active mobile device, tablet, and encrypted key fob present on the command deck. A second later, a sharp electronic tone chimed from the console. A single red beacon locked onto a device standing exactly 10 feet away from Victoria. Every head in the room turned in unison. Charles Caldwell, the Senior Vice President of Corporate Acquisitions, stood completely rigid. His hand was buried deep inside the pocket of his tailored suit jacket, his knuckles whitening around the frame of his encrypted corporate cellular device. He had been one of the executives laughing loudest when Garrett first warned them about the terminal handshake. Charles, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a register so cold it made the air in the room feel brittle. Remove your hand from your pocket. Caldwell swallowed hard, his face transitioning from a sickly pale to a deep, flushed crimson. He took a slow step backward, his eyes darting toward the open security gates of the elevator bank. Victoria, this is a system anomaly. The technician's primitive counterstrike must have misrouted the IP assignment to my device. I would never... The device in your pocket is currently broadcasting a continuous outbound data stream to a secure server owned by Jonathan Vance, Garrett interrupted quietly. He didn't rise from his chair. He didn't need to. His steady, masculine presence entirely dominated the space. The transmission contains the master decryption logs for the aerospace migration script. You didn't just give them access, Charles. You sold them the keys to the entire United States Defense Network integration. Caldwell's composure broke completely. He pulled his hand out of his pocket, revealing the glowing screen of his modified device, and lunged toward the open elevator doors. He didn't make it 2 steps. The 2 corporate security guards, who had spent the evening watching Garrett with growing reverence, acted instantly. They intercepted Caldwell with brutal efficiency, slamming him face first against the reinforced glass partition overlooking the lower core. The encrypted device slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floorboards. Victoria didn't even look at Caldwell as the guards pulled him to his feet, securing his wrists in heavy zip ties. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the broken pieces of the device, then slowly drifted up to Garrett. They offered me 50 million, Victoria, Caldwell screamed, his voice echoing frantically down the corridor as the guards dragged him toward the secure lower holding cells. 50 million! Apex was going to absorb us anyway after the contract bid failed. You were going to ruin us with this migration. The heavy doors of the elevator closed, cutting off his frantic shouting, leaving the command deck in a profound, ringing silence. Silas Finch stood beside the main console, looking like a man who had been thoroughly stripped of his pride, his status, and his professional identity. He looked at Garrett, then down at his own clean, uncalloused hands. Commander Vance, I don't know what to say. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't written the core framework. Ensure the data logs are fully partitioned, Silas, Garrett said softly, closing the black terminal interface and restoring the standard corporate layout to the screens. The system is stable now. The migration is complete. Your engineers can handle the standard diagnostic checks from here. He stood up from the console, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached down and picked up his dented travel mug, placing it carefully inside his worn metal toolbox. He adjusted the collar of his dark charcoal technician uniform, hiding the silver military dog tags once more beneath the fabric. To look at him now, no one would ever guess he was the mythic architect of the nation's defense network. He looked, once again, like a man who simply worked the night shift to provide for his family. Victoria walked toward him, still holding Julian tightly. The little boy had completely calmed down, his eyes wide with a child's pure admiration, as he looked at the quiet man who had talked him through the worst moments of his attack. "Mom," Julian whispered, leaning close to Victoria's ear but loud enough for the quiet room to hear. "Is he a superhero?" Victoria smiled faintly, a genuine, rare warmth softening the sharp contours of her face. "Yes, sweetie, I think he is." She stopped just 2 feet away from Garrett. The immense distance that wealth, power, and corporate hierarchy usually placed between her and the rest of the world had completely vanished. She looked at his tired eyes, the faint lines of worry on his forehead, and the absolute, unshakable strength radiating from his posture. For the first time in her life, she felt a profound sense of emotional security around another person. He hadn't saved her company for a bonus, or a promotion, or a multi-million-dollar payout. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. "Your shift ended 20 minutes ago, didn't it?" Victoria asked softly. Garrett glanced at his watch and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My daughter Lily is waiting for me down in the lobby. She usually falls asleep on the couch by the security desk if I'm late." Victoria's heart twinged with a sudden, unexpected emotion. A woman who had everything money could buy was looking at a man who possessed the one thing she secretly craved, absolute peace and a devotion to what truly mattered. "Let me walk down with you," Victoria said, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity that left no room for corporate refusal. "I want to meet her, and Garrett. We have a lot to talk about regarding your future at this company." Garrett closed the lid of his toolbox with a soft metallic click. "My future is right down in that lobby, Mrs. Sterling, but I don't mind the company on the ride down." The glass-walled elevator descended smoothly through the illuminated hollow core of the Vanguard spire. Outside the panoramic panes, the thousands of structural nodes that Garrett had just saved glowed a steady, tranquil green. The skyscraper was breathing normally again, its digital heartbeat restored to a perfect, rhythmic calm. Inside the elevator cab, the silence was entirely different from the panicked vacuum of the command deck. It was soft, contemplative, and filled with a warmth that Victoria Sterling had not experienced in longer than she cared to remember. She stood beside Garrett, still holding Julian's hand. She didn't put her designer heels back on. She stood barefoot on the polished steel floor, completely stripped of the corporate armor she usually wore like a shield. She looked at Garrett out of the corner of her eye. He was leaning casually against the brass handrail, his worn metal toolbox resting between his boots. He looked entirely unchanged by the fact that he had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar international conspiracy and revealed himself as a legendary military intelligence architect. His focus was entirely on the digital floor indicator ticking down toward the lobby. "You could have any position you want, Garrett," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying a rare, profound vulnerability. "I can sign a contract before sunrise. Chief Technology Officer, Global Head of Defensive Architecture. A salary that would ensure your daughter never has to worry about a single thing for the rest of her life. You would never have to wear a technician's uniform again." Garrett turned his head, a gentle, grounded smile touching his lips. He looked at her not as a billionaire executive offering a fortune, but as a person who understood the true definition of security. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Sterling," Garrett replied quietly, his voice naturally comforting. But my daughter already doesn't worry about a thing. She has me, and a multi-million-dollar salary usually comes with 70-hour work weeks and midnight emergency calls. I already gave those years to the government. I chose this uniform because when my shift ends, it actually ends. I get to be just a dad. Victoria stared at him, her chest tightening with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. She had spent her entire adult life accumulating wealth, power, and influence, believing it would protect her and Julian from the dangers of the world. Yet tonight, in the darkest hour of her career, all her billions couldn't buy the air her son needed to breathe. This man, without a single dollar of corporate power, gave absolute safety without even trying. The realizations hit her with stunning clarity. She had everything money could buy, except peace. And the man standing next to her carried peace in the very definition of his quiet masculinity. The elevator chimed, a soft, welcoming sound as the heavy glass doors slid open into the grand, cathedral-like marble lobby of the Vanguard spire. The harsh white security lights of the entryway cast long reflections across the pristine floors. Sitting on a large, plush leather armchair right beside the empty reception desk was a 7-year-old girl with bright, curious eyes and a mess of brown curls. Lily Vance was holding a worn, dog-eared storybook in her lap, her small sneakers dangling inches above the polished marble floor. The moment the elevator doors chimed, her face lit up with absolute joy. "Daddy!" Lily cried out, dropping her book onto the chair as she scrambled down. Garrett didn't hesitate. He dropped his heavy metal toolbox onto the marble floor with a resounding clang, abandoning his keys and his travel mug as he dropped to one knee. Lily sprinted across the grand lobby, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck as Garrett caught her, pulling her into a massive, protective embrace. He buried his face in her curls, his broad shoulders relaxing completely for the first time all night. He was no longer a tactical commander, a naval intelligence legend, or a facility technician. He was just a father holding his universe. "Hey there, sweetheart," Garrett whispered into her hair, his voice thick with a deep emotional warmth. "I'm sorry I'm late. Work ran a little bit long tonight. Did the big machine break again?" Lily asked, pulling back just enough to look into his tired eyes, her small hands resting flat against his charcoal uniform patches. "Yeah, it did," Garrett said, giving her a soft, reassuring squeeze, "but we fixed it. Everything is completely safe now." Julian slowly stepped forward from Victoria's side, his eyes locked onto Lily, then up to Garrett. He wasn't gasping for air anymore. The presence of Garrett and the absolute safety of the lobby had completely dissolved the last remnants of his panic. He looked at Lily, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his small breathing inhaler, holding it out toward her like a token of introduction. "My name is Julian," the boy offered shyly. "Your dad saved my life tonight. He talked to me through the speakers and helped me breathe." Lily looked at Julian, then turned her bright eyes back to her father, her expression filled with a proud, completely unsurprised knowingness. "I told you, Julian. My dad can fix absolutely anything in the whole world." Victoria walked over slowly, standing directly above the small circle. She looked down at the single father kneeling on the cold marble floor, completely unbothered by the corporate opulence around him, entirely consumed by the simple act of comforting his child. She felt a profound shift in her own heart, a rare, genuine desire to build a bridge between her chaotic world of wealth and this man's unbreakable sanctuary of peace. "Garrett," Victoria said, waiting until he stood up and faced her fully. She extended her hand toward him once more, not as a cold executive closing a business deal, but with a deep, reverent respect that promised a completely new future. "If I create a position that allows you to dictate your own hours, your own terms, and guarantees you are home every single evening to read her a bedtime story, would you consider staying at Sterling Dynamics? We don't just need your mind to protect our infrastructure, Garrett. I think this entire company needs your strength to remind us what we are actually building for." Garrett looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes, seeing the genuine, human warmth breaking through her billionaire armor. He allowed himself a slow, quiet nod, his fingers closing around hers in a firm, steady handshake that felt like the beginning of something entirely new. "I think we can find a balance, Mrs. Sterling," Garrett said softly. They stepped out into the crisp, cool Chicago night air together, the towering glass facade of the Vanguard spire stretching indefinitely into the starlit sky behind them. Inside the tower, hundreds of executives, engineers, and staff members would spend the next several weeks whispering the incredible story of the quiet single dad who told a billionaire CEO to step back, right before saving their entire world from the shadows. And now, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below what you thought of Garrett's incredible hidden identity reveal and what kind of emotional justice or quiet heroes we should tackle in our next viral story. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss an episode. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.